Welcome dear students to our English class of Standard 9th. Our lesson for today is The Fall of Troy Part 2. Said to have the face that launched 1,000 ships, Helen of Troy has been remembered, judged and hated by every age since she entered the written record 2,700 years ago. It is said that with great beauty comes great resentment. In Greek mythology, Helen of Troy is known as the woman whose beauty sparked the Trojan War. The Greeks sailed to Troy and 10 years of war commence. Then we see the death of great heroes on both sides. In this lesson, we will see the final battle in Troy. At last, Troy was taken not by force but by a trick. It was the cunning Odysseus who thought of a plan to obtain the victory. "Let us build a great wooden horse," he said, "big enough to hold men inside it, and let some of our best fighters hide in the horse. Then let us burn our tents and pretend to sail away in our ships. But instead of sailing away, we will return in the night. When the Trojans are asleep, we will attack the city and burn and kill." The Greek leaders decided to follow the advice of the wise Odysseus. So a great horse of wood was made by a skillful engineer, and the greatest heroes, Menelaus, Odysseus himself, and others entered it. The last man to go in being the architect himself, who knew the secret of opening and shutting the entrance. That evening the Greeks burnt their tents and sailed away in their ships. But they did not go very far. Only one man was left behind to persuade the Trojans to drag the horse into the city. Today, the phrase Trojan horse is defined as someone or something that is used to hide what is true or real in order to trick or harm an enemy. This meaning comes from the original story from Greek mythology. Here's a look at the story of Odysseus and the Trojan horse. After 10 long years of camping outside the walls of Troy, Odysseus had an idea. He was known for not only being a strong military leader, but for being clever as well. Odysseus's brilliant idea is to create a wooden horse, an animal that was sacred to the Trojans. This horse is called the Trojan horse. His plan also includes for the Greeks to pretend to sail away from Troy and leaving the huge wooden horse as a gift to the goddess Athena for winning the war. The Greeks also hide their ships near the island of Tenedos. In the meantime, there were 40 men, including Odysseus, who hid in the Trojan horse, and the rest of the army hid not too far away from the city of Troy. Now, it wasn't enough to use the wooden horse to hide. The horse had to enter the city in order to enable the hidden warriors to open the gates of the fortress from within. So, the Greeks left behind a man to persuade the Trojans to drag the horse into their city. Next day, the Trojans woke up expecting to go out and fight as they had done for the past 10 years. What delight and surprise they felt at the sight they saw on the seashore outside the walls. It seemed that the long siege was over at last. The tents had been burnt, The shore was deserted. The Greek ships had all gone. It's peace at last, they cried, and opened wide their gates, and came out in large numbers on the plain, and glad to be free again to go where they pleased. Then they saw on the sands the huge wooden horse. They gathered round it in astonishment, for it was indeed a wonderful piece of work. Now Odysseus's plan called for one man to remain outside the horse. He would act as though the Greeks had abandoned him, leaving the horse as a gift for the Trojans. An inscription was engraved on the horse reading, "For their return home, the Greeks dedicate this offering to Athena." Then they burnt their tents and left to Tenedos by night. Greek soldier Sinon was abandoned and was to signal the Greeks by lighting a beacon.
What is this? An offering to Poseidon. The Greeks are praying for a safe return home. This is a gift. We should take it to the temple of Poseidon.
As they were wondering how the horse had been built and why it had been left behind, they found a Greek with his hands tied together, lying under it. When the Trojans dragged him out, the man pretended to be very frightened to them. When he was commanded to tell them why the Greeks had gone and why they had left this horse behind, he pretended to tremble very much and refused to speak. When at last they threatened to kill him, he spoke and told them this false tale. The Greeks are tired of the long war and have sailed away in their ships, he said, but they are afraid of the long voyage home too. So they have made this horse and left it as an offering to the god of the sea. They wanted also to kill me and offer me as a sacrifice to the sea god, but I escaped and hid from them. But why did the Greeks make such a huge horse? Some of the Trojans asked. And the cunning Greek made this reply: "If they had made a smaller offering, you might have taken it into your city. Then the luck would have gone to the Trojans, not to the Greeks. That is why they made it too big to go inside your gates." Sinon, the only volunteer for the role, successfully convinces the Trojans that he had been left behind and that the Greeks are gone. Sinon tells the Trojans that the horse is an offering to the goddess Athena, made to atone for their previous desecration of her temple at Troy by the Greeks, and ensure a safe journey home for the Greek fleet. Sinon tells the Trojans that the horse was built to be too large for them to take into their city and gain the favor of Athena for themselves. The Trojans were delighted to hear this. "The Greeks have gone," they said, "and the walls are no longer necessary. Let us make a hole in the wall and drag the horse in." Their wise priest warned them not to do so. "It may be a trick that will ruin us," he said. "You will bring disaster on the city if you break down the walls." But they were so excited they paid no attention to his words. They broke down part of their strong wall in order to drag the horse in. All that day the Trojans feasted and drank and celebrated. After all their celebrations, they went to sleep and slept soundly. But that day of rejoicing was soon followed by a night of terror and death. So we see that while questioning Sinon, the Trojan priest Laocoon guesses the plot and warns the Trojans. In fact, King Priam's daughter Cassandra, the soothsayer of Troy, insists that the horse will be the downfall of the city and its royal family. She too is ignored, hence their doom and loss of the war. The Trojans were so superstitious that they gullibly believed in the fake story of the Greek who was left behind. They really thought that if they got the wooden horse inside their city, they would be blessed by the sea god, and so they even tore down a part of the wall to drag the horse in, risking the security of their own city. That night the city of Troy celebrated and rejoiced as the Greeks were gone and the long siege was over at last. The Greek ships had not sailed far. As soon as they were hidden by an island, they had lowered their sails and dropped anchor and waited for the night. In the darkness, the fleet sailed back, and the leading ship, which was Agamemnon's, bore a red light high on its mast. The Greek who was watching for the return of the fleet crept to the wooden horse and gave the signal. The side of the horse opened, the Greeks climbed out and opened the gates. The whole Greek army entered the sleeping city. Immediately the Greeks set fire to the houses and towers and palaces and began to burn and kill. Troy was filled with the sight of leaping flames and the sound of shouting and noise of weapons and the cries of weeping women. The sleeping Trojans sprang out of their beds, but they were taken by surprise. Their enemies were right inside their walls, and many of the Trojans were killed before they could put on their armor and seize their weapons. So we see that the Trojans decided to keep the horse and turned to a night of mad revelry and celebration. Now, revelry means lively and noisy festivities, especially when these involve drinking a large amount of alcohol. Sinon, a Greek spy, signaled the fleet stationed at Tenedos when it was midnight and the clear moon was rising, and the soldiers from inside the horse emerged and killed the guards. The Greeks entered the city and killed the sleeping population. A great massacre followed, which continued into the day. The Trojans, fueled with desperation, fought back fiercely, despite being disorganized and leaderless. With the fighting at its height, some donned fallen enemies' attire and launched surprise counterattacks in the chaotic street fighting. Other defenders hurled down roof tiles and anything else heavy down on the rampaging attackers. The outlook was grim though, and eventually the remaining defenders were destroyed along with the whole city. A bright light lit up the night as palaces and houses and temples and towers went up in flames. The Trojans fought as well as they could, but it was all in vain. Old King Priam was killed with all his brave sons. Hector's wife and his old mother and sister were carried off as slaves by the conquerors. Their fate was in contrast to Helen's when King Menelaus rushed through the city looking for her and found her in her palace. She hung her head in shame and sorrow as she faced her former husband. Her voice was choked with emotion and she could not speak. But Menelaus forgave her and she went back with him. For it was only Aphrodite who had turned her heart away from her home and her husband and her child. When morning came, nothing was left of the proud rich city that had resisted attack for 10 years.
Let it burn! Let Troy burn! Burn it! Burn it around! Burn it! I promise you, brother! I promise you! Burn it! Burn it! Burn it around!
At daybreak, the Greeks, not yet sated with Trojan blood, decided to pull away those who were still seeking protection at the altars of the god and slay them, who looked, as they say, like trembling sheep. Old King Priam with his sons were killed. When they had almost completed their work, they divided the captives of royal blood among them. Prince Hector's wife, old mother, and sister were taken as slaves by the Greeks. The Greeks threw Hector's infant son, Astyanax, down the walls of Troy, either out of cruelty and hate or to end the royal line and the possibility of a son's revenge. Helen's husband Menelaus, after Paris's death, also intended to kill Helen, but overcome by her beauty, he threw down his sword and forgave her. So she went back to Greece with him. The Greeks then burnt the city. It is said that some Trojans escaped during the siege. They fled on boats out of Troy to search for a new home. So, my dear students, regardless of how connected it is to fact, the Trojan War myth has a lasting impact on the Greeks and on us. Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus had inhabited an age of heroes. Trojan War was a legendary conflict between the early Greeks and the people of Troy, dated by later Greek authors to the 12th or 13th century BCE. The war stirred the imagination of the ancient Greeks more than any other event in their history, and was celebrated in the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. So, dear students, we are done with the lesson. Hope you have understood. Kindly note, the images of the characters are used for representational purpose. They are not actual pictures. That's all for now. Thank you.